Okay, let's dive into the story behind one of American history's most famous and maybe most misunderstood nicknames.
I mean, you've probably seen the name Mad Anthony floating around, maybe on a brewery in Fort Wayne, Indiana.
Or, hey, on a rock band's tour poster in Ohio. Or maybe even as the name of a super intense mud run out in Virginia.
So when you hear that name, Mad Anthony, it just sounds heroic, right? Bold, daring, fearless. But, the real story behind General Anthony Wayne's famous nickname, it is a whole lot more complicated. Was it a badge of honor, or was it actually an insult?
All right, so there are these popular stories out there about how he got the name. You might have heard the one about a disgruntled soldier. That tale didn't even show up in print until 1829, decades after Wayne was already gone. Or maybe you heard it came from his heroic charge at Stony Point. Well, the thing is, the earliest written records tell a very, very different story. Believe it or not, during his lifetime, pretty much every single time someone called him Mad Anthony, it was meant to criticize him. Seriously. In 1780, you had a British major mocking him in a poem. A year later, an American army doctor straight up wrote that Wayne's tactics were just pure madness. And by 1794, it got even worse. A letter from someone in his own camp got published in a newspaper calling him mad and sanguinary, which is just a fancy way of saying he was bloodthirsty. And what's crazy here is just how personal these attacks got. I mean, that 1794 editorial, it was absolutely brutal. This wasn't just someone saying, hey, I don't like your strategy. No, this was a complete takedown of his entire character. They painted him as this tyrannical, unstable commander, which is a far cry from the hero we imagine today, right? Okay, so it's clear his critics thought he was just reckless. But the big question is, were they right? Or was there actually a very specific method to all this so-called madness? And this is where you can really see why people thought he was mad. Okay, so think about it. Most armies back then fought these conventional daylight battles, lining up, firing musket volleys, dragging slow artillery around. But Wayne, he was doing what was basically unthinkable at the time. Surprise night attacks? You bet, even in the middle of winter. He drilled his men for these relentless bayonet-only charges, and sometimes he'd just leave the cannons behind so he could be faster and more agile. To everyone else, this looked like pure madness, but to Wayne, it was just innovation. And here's the kicker. This innovation wasn't coming from some unhinged guy. It was the result of deep, almost obsessive study. See, Wayne was a self-taught military officer, and he read constantly. There's this fantastic story where the British captured his personal baggage trailer. They must have thought they hit the jackpot. Fine wines, luxuries, but nope. Instead, they found it was just packed to the brim with books on military tactics and strategy. He was a true believer in intense, repetitive training and absolute discipline, especially when it came to using the bayonet. Okay, so let's see how all of this, the studying, the training, the unconventional tactics, how it all comes together in the one battle that would define his entire career, cement his complicated legacy, and, frankly, change the course of American expansion. So the situation was pretty dire. The U.S. had just suffered two disastrous defeats in the Northwest Territory. So President Washington turns to Wayne, puts him in command. His mission is simple: succeed where everyone else has failed. And it's his methodical approach here that would earn him a brand new nickname, this time from his adversaries, the chief that never sleeps. So you might expect Mad Anthony to just rush in, right? But he did the exact opposite. He ran a slow, careful, and incredibly methodical campaign. He spent a full year just training his army, the Legion. Then he pushed into enemy territory by building this chain of forts to protect his supply lines. Get this, his army would march only until the early afternoon, and then they'd stop to build a fortified camp every single day. It was that relentless vigilance that earned him that new name. And then, on August 20, 1794, the Battle of Fallen Timbers finally kicks off. And this is when Wayne's so-called madness was finally unleashed, but as perfectly disciplined fury. As his front line of militia started to fall back, he gave a simple, direct order, the one his troops had trained for over and over and over again: charge the damned rascals with the bayonet. And that charge? It was absolutely devastating. In just a little over an hour, Wayne's disciplined legion had completely routed the Native American forces. It was a decisive, overwhelming victory for the United States. And this is where you see the real strategic genius of the whole campaign. As the Confederate warriors fled the battlefield, they ran straight for the nearby British-held Fort Miami, expecting help. But the British commander, well, he wasn't about to start a war with the U.S. over this, so he ordered the gates shut. Right there, in that one moment, the alliance between the British and the Native American tribes was just shattered. So, as you can imagine, the victory at Fallen Timbers had massive consequences. I mean, it completely reshaped the American frontier, but it also cemented Wayne's legacy in ways that are, both celebrated and still pretty deeply controversial. The battle led directly to the Treaty of Greenville a year later, in 1795. And under that treaty, the defeated tribes were forced to give up these enormous tracts of land. We're talking most of what is now the state of Ohio. And that just opened the floodgates for American settlement. But Wayne's story doesn't end there. It takes one last really bizarre turn. So he dies in 1796. But years later, when his son comes to move the body to the family plot, he discovers it's too well preserved to transport. So they hire a doctor to, and I'm not making this up, boil the flesh off the bones. The bones were then packed up and taken to the family plot, while the rest of him was reburied right there in the original grave. Which means, to this day, Anthony Wayne is literally buried in two different places at once. So over time, as the 19th century went on, something really interesting happened. All that specific context, the tactical debates, the harsh criticisms from his peers, it all just kind of faded from public memory. And what was left? The image of his dramatic, decisive victories. So the nickname Mad Anthony, it completely transformed. It flipped from an insult that meant reckless and unstable into this badge of honor that celebrated the exact bold and daring spirit that his critics once hated him for. Which really leaves us with a final question, one that kind of challenges how we remember history and its heroes. Knowing what we know now, that the name Mad Anthony was originally an insult, born from mockery and used by his enemies to make him look incompetent, does that change how we should think about it or use it today? It's something to think about, isn't it?